Hello, everybody. It's really lovely to see you all, well, virtually today. I wanted to say good morning and good afternoon to you, and to thank you for joining our meeting on reconciliation, which is a really important event for our college. My name is Carly Kehoe, and I'm the president of our college, and I'm based at St. Mary's University in Halifax. I'm speaking today from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. Mi'kma'ki is covered by the treaties of peace and friendship, which the Mi'kmaq and Maliseet peoples first signed with the British Crown in 1725. The treaties did not deal with the surrender of lands and resources, but in fact recognized Mi'kmaq and Maliseet title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between nations. The Peace and Friendship Treaty was reaffirmed on 22nd of November, 1752. I also want to acknowledge that there was a fundamental disconnect about what the treaty actually meant. Unlike the Mi'kmaq, the British Crown never intended for this to be a treaty of peace and friendship. It never intended for the Mi'kmaq to be recognized as an equal nation. Rather, the treaties focused on the submission of the Mi'kmaq and the implementation of English law at the expense of Mi'kmaq law. Many of us are looking for guidance on how to be involved with, how to understand, and how to move forward with our processes of reconciliation. We have a responsibility as Canada's research leaders to engage meaningfully, honestly, and respectfully in these processes. We also have a responsibility as individuals who live where we do. Some of us are already or will be leading our universities, national or international science academies and societies, think tanks, institutes, companies. Our colleagues and our students need us to lead by example and with commitment to the processes of reconciliation. As a historian of British imperialism and the Catholic Church, I feel a heavy weight on my shoulders to rethink and update my practice, to talk openly, honestly, and respectfully with my students about how the colonial structures that govern us and restrict us have evolved. And this weight grew heavier with the discovery of the 215 children at the Kamloops Residential School and with the knowledge that more are to come. The first speaker that we have is Frank Deer. And you have your college, your program, but I'll just say that Frank is an associate professor of education and he's a Canada Research Chair of Indigenous Education in the Faculty of Education at the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg. Thanks very much. Over to you, Frank.
Now for that, Carly. It's a pleasure to be here, here virtually with you today. I want to say Niawagoa, thank you very much to Carly, the folks at the college, and the RSC broadly for enabling initiatives such as this to facilitate further conversation. That word conversation is going to come up a few times in the brief time I have with you this morning, and I hope some of the conversations that move forward. I come to you at a time when the issue of reconciliation is still a relatively new issue. Certainly new for academics, certainly new for institutions such as the Royal Society of Canada, and certainly new in the consciousness of many. And we're still at the outset of understanding what we mean with that term and how we can go about ministering to its needs, however we understand those needs to be. It's interesting. I work in a faculty of education, as Carly introduced me, and for the first time we have a course offering on reconciliation, particularly for graduate level students, and that course had its last class last night, and it was an interesting experience trying to create some dialogue that was worthwhile having. The disciplinary context is really quite interesting to me and might map onto some of the things we'll talk about today, for the most part, in service professionals who work in schools or related fields. My orientation towards this is something I have to own up to right away. And I've explained this to students, and I've done this at recent workshops of different sorts for which this topic is central. I'm one who's very interested in the orientation toward reconciliation. It's an orientation I think is going to be coming up a couple of times this morning. And it's an orientation toward reconciliation as opposed to a focus upon what may emerge from reconciliation. Now, those two aren't mutually exclusive areas of endeavor. However, for many, the focus is upon, for instance, a proxy for understanding reconciliation. The 94 calls to action are one example of such an understanding, you know, a set of imperatives that we could pull off our shelves or put on our computer desktops and use that as a means of understanding what we can do in regards to reconciliation. That's very important. I don't want anybody to think I'm dismissive of that, but it is one element of an area of concern that is sometimes overemphasized at the expense of the orientation that's really quite necessary for coming to understand what we can do in regard to reconciliation. See, the goal-oriented approach to reconciliation, as important as it is, sort of has, in some cases, in my humble experience, provides a tunnel vision of sorts for some, that what we can do as an institution, as a collective, in regard to that outcome will guide our action. And that may very well be a thumbs up to our reconciliatory journey. But I want to put this idea out there that a focus also ought to be provided to the orientation that we have. And I'll venture to sort of put some conceptual weight upon that idea. And I hope that it's something that we could get on board with. So I want to sort of explore for a moment where we've been in this brief time in regard to reconciliation. Some may focus on the year 2015, when the final report of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was released. I was in Ottawa that week because Congress was there, so I happened to be there, and I was a part of many of the conversations in and around the release of that report. And much of our attention is on, and has been on, the raison d'etre for the as we understand it, of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and that is, of course, the Indian residential schools experiences of Canada, and that those issues have become again forefront in many of our consciousnesses as a result of the discovery of that mass grave in British Columbia last week. And some of the things that and feelings and experiences and have been raised because of that sort of brings us to this idea that the Indian residential schools experience is central to this. However, a survey of the report and all of its volumes, and as well as the outworking of the calls to action, the 94 calls to action, ought to speak to an important issue, that it is important for us to be mindful of the Indian residential schools experience, but it's more than that, frankly. And the current and historical First Nations, Métis, and Inuit experiences in this nation state is one that covers all manner of human concern, from health to well-being to interface with government, and much of that has to do with educational experiences. A lot of it does not. And I think we have a lot of to account for, if I may say we, in regard to how we've been addressing this issue, this ongoing issue of Indigenous peoples in the nation state of Canada. But there are challenges for many to interface with that idea. It is sometimes, as David White intimates in his volume of a few years ago, which I really love, David White's work is amazing, about the honesty the truth that we hope to seek is sometimes a truth that is difficult to take on board. It is difficult for us to confront our past. It is difficult for us to come to understand that, given the potential connections that have with all of us, right? There's a responsibility that I'm going to speak of. I hope I have time to get into it to some depth in regard to that responsibility. But one of the things that is important to situate ourselves or to confront is this idea that in order to come to a better place, we have to put ourselves somewhere where we otherwise ought not go. For many, it may be reduced to the imagery of, for instance, what's been going on at Ryerson University over the last little while, or other areas. For some, it may be an exercise in exploring some of the more recent issues that are germane to the tensions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in Canada. I'm from Kahnawake, south of Montreal. I was in the community when the Oka crisis was occurring. And this is one of the things that I think we need to be aware of, is that there's an experience on offer there that informs the truth, that informs how we interface with our past. It's something that I think that we need to be mindful of, that when we're coming to understand others and their experiences, one way of understanding it is understanding that there's a space between, how should I put it, my journey to come to know something and somebody else's reality of being that thing. Okay? If I wish to be involved in reconciliatory activities or conversations, there is that space, because and some of the survivors and their descendants of residential schools, I didn't attend residential school, right? To come to understand that is to understand their experience, and that space between me trying to come to understand this and their experiences of that experience, that thing is a place where, as Dwayne Donald, who's a scholar from the University of Alberta, once put, that can be the space where we juxtapose perspectives. And it comes, and I think he might have coined this phrase, the ethical relationality, that space of ethical relationality where we could come to understand one another. His work on Indigenous métissage has been of a great benefit to me. So there's other ways, of course, of looking to this, and I'll have to skip along here because at the forefront of the Reconciliation Commission was its principal, of course, head commissioner, Murray Sinclair. He put it like this, and I think it's one of the ways in conceptualizing reconciliation that I find very useful. The idea that it is a journey towards a new relationship, one that is which a sense of our shared history is maintained. It speaks to all manner of different experiences for which you have different peoples with different experiences, different contributions to societal good, different contributions, potential and real, to a potential relationship that can move us forward. However, we do have to make sure we understand why we're in that journey, why we are contributing to that new relationship, and there lies the history. And yes, Indian residential schools are an important part of it. The day schools experience of which I was a part of is a part of it. The ongoing and difficult history of the way in which we have interfaced with Indigenous women and girls in particular as captured by the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's and Girls report and the recommendations and ongoing conversations. I think that's central. It is sometimes said that the manner to which we respect and enable our women can be an important contributing factor to any growth we have as a society. Now, there's a couple of truths at work there that I think we need to be mindful of. That for me, and I'll speak only myself, but I think this will map onto other people's experience. My mother was my first teacher. My mother was my first healthcare provider. My mother was the first person to give me language. Therefore, the first person to give me meaning, right? If you understand it in that way, perhaps how palpable it is that these roles are important. I'm coming to you from Ganawage, Ganekahaga territory, for which the matriarchal dimensions of clan mothership is quite important. Once you come to understand that, I think that's really important. So there's all manner of different things that come to the reconciliatory table that we have to be mindful of. I'll just for a moment here, I'll bring this back to what I opened up with, that this is I have an orientation-based approach to reconciliation. You'll have other people, and Carly and the RSC could have invited others to speak to this issue who have other orientations, and those are important too. One may be understood to be the action-based approach, the activist approach, if you will, where true change is focused upon. I'm not dismissive of that, and that is not something that is excluded from this approach. But I think if we are, and I'm going to say if it's unfair, then take me up on it, that if we are at the outset, still relatively speaking, to this journey, then I think this approach actually merits some consideration, that we understand what reconciliation is and how we can come to support this in our own lives, in our institutions, through our professional life. And there are approaches to that orientation that are really quite important. And again, Murray put it quite nicely, and he was speaking of the opportunities on offer for teachers who may be doing important work in our schools. Of course, I think I invite you all to imagine how this may be apropos of our own professional lives. The issues in regard to how we enter into conversations, and you may hear more of this too, the impulse too in settings such as this to tell others who we are and what our contributions are, what our aptitudes, what our backgrounds, what our ancestry. You hear that sometimes there's some pushback in some quarters to such approaches to entering into conversations, because it requires in the thoughts of many to be vulnerable to this. How can I ask you to enter into any sort of brief, however brief, relationship with me if I don't talk about myself and tell you who I am? That's really important. And that was central to Murray's points about these key questions. Where do I come from? It's important to this conversation, potentially. I impress upon you to consider why that's important. Where am I going within the context of this reconciliatory journey? Why am I here? What are my responsibilities, for instance? And as important, who am I? What sort of identity do I bring to this? And how does that identity map onto the conversations about reconciliation? Very quite important. We're at this point in regard to reconciliation for a manner of different things. I focused for a moment on Indian residential schools, but I put it to you that there are other issues at work there that were, of course, uncovered by the TRCC and were captured by the 94 calls to action. Marie Baptiste, someone I'm proud to call her a friend. Many of you know Marie's work, and has done some lovely work and captured it in this way. And residential schools is central to this, but I think we can readily apprehend how these issues are quite different, and the reasons why we need to consider how a reconciliatory journey is important. Duncan Campbell Scott did put on offer on the record some words that also sort of give me pause to consider why we require a reconciliatory journey, because and sometimes I find myself focusing upon the words of statesmen, if you will, of the time, but there's also an ethos, social ethos of the time that sort of informed that attitude. And sometimes I catch myself thinking to what extent that ethos is still resident in Canadian society. And I invite all of you to consider that yourselves. Couple of final points. Land acknowledgements have become an important feature of how we interface with others and in the lands in which we do it. And I sometimes find them very important. I sometimes find them somewhat troubling. And sometimes I'm not sure on what side of the fence I sit on, but that really depends on the situation. I offer this for people to consider, especially, and I'm presuming most of us are situated within universities, to be mindful of what our institutions commit to on our behalf and what we commit to ourselves. Because it may appear to many of us to be an important commitment to make, whatever commitment we're making. Many of those commitments are central to the land acknowledgements that are recited. They are recited at times. A survey of the CAUT website has that document that has all the different universities and colleges in Canada and so on. I find myself asking, for myself and on behalf of my own university, what business do I have saying that I'm committed to reconciliation? I find that a useful way of coming to understand my responsibilities, right? Am I saying, for instance, that I'm a good member of Canadian society in 2021? Am I saying that I care about Indigenous peoples? Am I saying I'm an advocate? Am I saying I'm an ally? If I'm non-Indigenous, am I saying I'm a settler? There's all manner of different things, but most important perhaps is, what do I bring to that reconciliatory journey, that relationship, real or potential? That's an important question to confront, I would have thought. Many of us may be wondering what our responsibilities are as members of respective universities or institutions, or even the Royal Society of Canada, the college, the fellowship, whatever. And I hope there's some conversation today about this very issue, that there are some things that can really be done. Some of it, I'll tell you, I'm happy to put it this way, is really quite low-hanging fruit in regard to, for instance, the manner through which we can support these conversations to occur in our respective universities, how these conversations can occur between institution and community, the manner through which we encourage, invite, commit to inviting Indigenous peoples into our respective institutions, that we affect our institutions in a way that will be inviting, useful, appropriate, and so on. There are some difficult challenges. I sometimes point to the disciplinary changes as being one such difficult challenge. How do we, because the raison d'etre of our universities is, if you will, the discovery and dissemination of knowledge. We come to those universities with our disciplinary orientations. For many disciplinary orientations, there's a long legacy of exploring these issues. For others, this is really a new journey. And for many, we are wedded to our disciplinary orientations at the expense of exploring new avenues of consideration, of inquiry, conversations in which Indigenous perspectives really ought to be considered as important. I'm noticing I went beyond my time by a couple of minutes, but I hope I could leave it to you with this, that there is this space that I mentioned before between, I'll speak on behalf of everybody, maybe that's unfair, to enter, and maybe you've already been in this relationship already. There's this space between you and who else is a part of that conversation, right? And that may be the ethical interface, the ethical space in which those conversations have. So generosity of spirit, honesty, I'm all about it. And I invite you to consider how you can contribute to your respective conversations in a similar way. Nyalgoa, thank you very much.
Thank you for that, Frank. That was excellent. I just want to introduce our next speaker, who is Professor Val Napoleon, Indigenous Peoples Counselor, the Law Foundation Chair of Indigenous Justice and Governance, and the Director and Founding Director of the Indigenous Law Research Institute. Val, over to you. And then
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for Carly and to Frank. All right, so the topic of this presentation and the conversations that we hope to have today, we drew on a metaphor of a quilt, one that's multicolored. And you can see here we have some ravens. They are grandmother ravens, kokum ravens. They are Indigenous feminist tricksters, born of Indigenous feminist consciousness in Canada and around the world. And they join us because I heard one time that people listen better if they have something to look at. So here are some things to look at. So I love the idea of reconciliation being a quilt, one that's being constantly formed. I am a quilter, so it's a metaphor that makes sense to me. There are multiple histories. There are many pieces of different sizes and shapes and colors. There's millions of stitches that stitch layers together, that stitch pieces together. There are different kinds of beauty depending on the perspectives that we bring, similar to what Frank has been talking about with the, how do we step into this journey of reconciliation? And there's going to be patterns, there's going to be flaws, and there's going to be dissimilarities. There are also gaps and torn places that need mending. So this idea of the quilt is one that I'm using for this talk as well, with different ideas that are being brought here and multiple perspectives that they're being drawn from. So the TRC, set up a historic and living context for reconciliation. And as those children's remains in Kamloops now demand, this is and must be an ongoing process. So sometimes it seems that the whole world, especially if we look across Canada, we look at community levels, we look at institutions and so on, it seems that everything is comprised of various forms and states of reconciliation that involve different societal scales and individual business that people are taking up in their lives. So some of those, they're coming apart. Some are holding through all the stress and the struggles. And there's also threads of hope as well as grief. What I want to do in the time that I have is to name some of the actual and potential sites for reconciliation. And keeping in mind that no one conversation is ever going to capture the entirety and complexity of the kinds of things that we need to take up. So part of what we see is a need for different ways of comprehending and working with reconciliation within Indigenous peoples and between different peoples as well. So here, you know, we have historically Indigenous peoples that had relationships that mattered, that were horizontal in non-state societies. Forms of governance and law reflected those non-states. Part of what's happened with colonization, as we know, is a political reorientation to the state as being the vertical relationships that matter. That reorientation has generated lots of conflict in our communities, continuing conflicts, and we've seen those play out in different ways in the last several years in Canada. So reconciliation here would be about articulating Indigenous legalities and examining the consequences of imposed changes. So it's not about going back in time, it's about looking at what have the consequences of those imposed changes been to how we manage ourselves as peoples and deciding what to keep as we go forward. Another site of potential and in some cases actual reconciliation is when we think about Indigenous legal pluralism. So when we think across legal orders, it requires that we think about difference. It requires that reconciliation either allow the differences to be in how people come together or enable deliberative changes from different people's perspectives, from societal perspectives. So we have histories in Canada, Indigenous histories, where we had legal pluralism, where there were points of reconciliation between peoples. And my point is that there are those tools, those legal tools that are available for today's challenges. It requires, among other things, taking Indigenous law seriously as law and looking at how those legalities, those different ways of managing oneself, how they can be brought forward. The power relations between legal orders is one of the tensions that's going to require critical examination, and it's also going to require constant tending. One of the consequences of colonization, of course, has been the freeze drying of Indigenous peoples into various representations of ourselves as if we don't change through time. And we know that the lived experience of Indigenous peoples has more than one people in some locations. Again, I'm talking about time over time changes. Time depth is really important. But in northern British Columbia and some parts of northern Alberta, for instance, there are Cree and Denizah people living together, different linguistic groups, different legal orders, different legal histories in Canada. And people on the ground and in families and in communities have, to varying degrees, managed those differences. We could learn a lot about reconciliation between peoples through looking at how is it that people are doing that. So, and I can, if there are questions about that, I can certainly speak more to it. I just taught a course along with Hadley Friedland, which brought together Cree and Denizah law. There are numerous examples coming up in the lower courts where courts have begun to look at Indigenous law not as fact or evidence, but as a source of principled reasoning. And here are just several examples. There are lots more. And so this is really an exciting site of potential reconciliation in terms of how how do we solve problems like within and between Indigenous peoples and with Canada? And how is it that we can understand the process of justice as not simply having Canadian law as the default? So there's lots more to learn here. Frank has mentioned gendered violence. This is another critical area for Indigenous peoples, but not just within Indigenous peoples, but also with Canada. There are spaces of lawlessness which have been created by the undermining of Indigenous law and where Canadian law has failed. And in those spaces of lawlessness, violence happens, and the most vulnerable pay for that. And if we think about sexism and gendered violence, we can think about the benign stereotypes and essentialisms of Indigenous women at one end. And at the other end, we can think about the horrific murders and disappearances of Indigenous women and girls. And they are connected because all the way along that spectrum are different decisions that are made that have direct material consequences on the lives of Indigenous women and girls. So there's much more that could be said here about how Indigenous law and Indigenous institutions have to have as the foundational rock for them, the starting place is Indigenous feminist starting place, where how we think about those institutions and the work of law and so on have to be to deal with sexism and gendered violence, so that it's not an add-on, but a part of the fabric of our societies. And it's really important that we don't idealize the past. Otherwise, we're going to fail to learn from that past. So reconciliation here means many things, including the rebuilding of Indigenous law and the rebuilding of safe communities. So I direct and I teach in the Indigenous Law degree program at the University of Victoria. It's a 4-year degree program where students receive a degree in Indigenous law and the other in Canadian law. And this is another amazing site of reconciliation for at all levels. Next year, our first cohort are going to be graduating. This September, we take in our 4th cohort. So this is where we're looking at different legal orders as well as common law. And we have students thinking across legal orders, drawing doctrine, principles, and so on from those legal orders to do the work of law, in the practice and in the theory of law at every possible level. So that's, reconciliation here is thinking across legal orders in a way that engages with the full scope of law and with the full complexity of Indigenous legal orders. So this is, for me, one of the biggest and most hopeful sites for what reconciliation can be in Canada. When I think about the future of reconciliation, I want to imagine reconstructing Canada in a way that's based on reconciliation, so that it's hardwired into all aspects of Canada as a society. So this is a framework that's based on Jim Tully's work, Practices of Freedom, Practices of Citizenship. And so at every possible level, constructing our understanding of the political as being founded on reconciliation. And from that founding understanding, taking positions on whatever it is that we're working on. It means looking at conflicts in a way that will advance reconciliation. It means generating and creating new ways of understanding ourselves, civic imagination for ourselves, because we live in the worlds that we believe exist. So that imagination of who we are as multiple peoples in Canada is absolutely critical. And I'm almost out of time. So designing governance, again, how does it incorporate reconciliation? What does that mean for how we manage the public affairs of our governments? What does it mean for all of the ways that our institutions, as Frank has already mentioned and Carly has as well, but how do they take up through its public and internal faces that work? How do we how do we reorganize ourselves so we spend money differently, not in all of the rich places, but that we distribute that, and also knowledge and the generation of knowledge. It means rethinking how we understand citizenship. And that understanding has to include those reconciliation possibilities in terms of where do I start and others begin? And how do we transform the spaces around us? So there's many possibilities for all of this in terms of taking next steps, considering that which is perhaps invisible around us, making visible work that is yet to be done. So here, reconciliation is ultimately about rebuilding citizenries and maintaining the complexity of the work of reconciliation and not dumbing it down in any way. This rebuilding of citizenries is not just important for Indigenous peoples, it's important for all of Canada. Like to push back, you know, anti-intellectualism and all of those different aspects of our lives. And with that, perhaps we'll have time for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Val. That was excellent. I think we have time for a couple of questions.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Val, I love your ravens. Oh, and I love that you quilted them and painted them. Those are awesome. Nice to see everyone. So I'm really glad to be here and to be having this conversation. And I just wonder, you know, Val, and maybe some of the other leaders of this session, would you be willing to say a bit about the term reconciliation? I think some of the things I've been reading over the last years since the TRC have been so critical of that term. And so I'm just wondering, you know, what is it about that particular language that you find useful moving forward, as opposed to maybe some of the other terms that are sometimes in use, like decolonization, equally complex, certainly. Yeah, so I'd just love to hear a bit about that. Thanks.
Thank you for that. We all have words that get up our nose one way or the other, and I don't mean to make light of people's concerns at all. Decolonization is one of the ones that gets up my nose because who are we beyond colonization? Are we constantly going to be reacting against that? Like you know, we're peoples, we're societies, and we're not defined by colonization. And so once we, I just don't like language that I interpret as limiting us to that. Insofar as reconciliation, I know that there are concerns, and people have called it, you know, another form of colonization. People have said we should use the word of, there's been no reconciliation or no conciliation, so how can we reconcile? There's many criticisms that make sense, and I guess it's just a matter of finding what's a way forward. What's the language that will enable us to talk to one another? We can agree to disagree on those words. We can agree to disagree insofar as our interpretation of events. But the main thing is that we learn to talk to each other about things that are difficult, about things that are going to cause emotions and concerns, and so we have to deal with ourselves in those conversations in a way that doesn't shut it down, doesn't shut down the conversation. It's really hard to do that. So thank you.
Thanks very much for that question, and Val for the answer. I'm just conscious of time, and I've been